Welcome to Another World is Possible, Rethinking Conservation in and from China. I'm Emily Baum, Director of the Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine. This is the Long Institute's last webinar of the calendar year, so we're very happy to have you here with us today. We are already planning several exciting events for next year, but in the meantime, you can always catch up on our other webinars on our YouTube channel, and you can follow us on our social media, and we'll drop the link for those in the chat. So in October of this year, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity was held in Kunming, China. And at it, Chinese President Xi Jinping promised to promote what he referred to as ecological civilization by becoming one of the world's leaders in conservation and environmental protection. Now, we often hear about China's struggle with pollution and its loss of biodiversity. China is one of the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gases. Coal still makes up nearly 2/3 of China's energy consumption. And China is among the top countries in the world where its biodiversity is most at risk. However, we don't always hear about China's efforts to prioritize ecological preservation. In recent years, the Chinese government has laid out a series of sweeping reforms to build a national park system, to protect the country's wildlife, and to achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2060. So how do we assess China's conservation reforms? Well, today we are lucky to be joined by one of the world's leading experts on environmentalism in China, Sze Ping. Sze Ping has 2 decades of experience leading international and domestic environmental NGOs in China, including serving as CEO of the World Wildlife Fund and serving in leadership and governance roles in organizations including Greenpeace, Friends of Nature, Society of Entrepreneurs and Ecology, China Youth Climate Action Network, and Global Call for Climate Action. He's also founded 2 of his own NGOs, Forward Works and Greenovation Hub, and his work for these organizations has won him numerous awards and accolades, including being named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. Sze Ping holds an EMBA from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and he currently serves as the Program Director of the Sequoia Climate Fund, a foundation that aims to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. This year, we are also lucky to call him a visiting fellow at the Long U.S.-China Institute. So Sze Ping is going to speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then we will open up for audience Q&A. If you would like to ask a question at any point in this webinar, please do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In total, this webinar will last for about 1 hour. If you're not able to stay until the end, we will send a recording out to all registered participants in the next day or so. And without any further ado, Sze Ping, please go ahead.
Yeah, oops, thank you. Thanks, Emily. Let me share my screen. Yeah, can you see it in full screen? Yeah. All right, well, thanks for coming. I am very much honored to be invited to share some of my reflection of my work in China in the last 2 decades, working for the environment and people there. Today, I want to share some of these learnings, and it was not meant to be a defense or an accusation of China's environmental challenges. Rather, I tried to put China in the context of both the contemporary global stage, the unprecedented common environmental existential challenge human beings are facing on this planet, but also in a kind of a historical perspective. I want to share with you this poster that I find in WWF, my last organization, the last organization that I work with. I actually quite like this poster. It is the Panda logo, but then with a vision of sort of people in harmony with nature. And I like it especially because it comes out from China. It relates very much to the theme of the talk that I want to share with you. And I use another word is possible, but the Chinese word for that really is 北有洞天, is a Taoist concept of, out of the society, there is a place where you can connect to the sky, to heaven, to the supernatural, and there you find the possibility of going beyond the reality, going beyond the limitation of what we see. And I'll come back to this one at the end of the presentation. So I want to share a few personal reflection, and then I talk about a few insights from that. A few years ago, I was in Changqing Nature Reserve, which now is part of the Giant Panda National Park. It is in Qinning in Shanxi province, south of Xi'an. This area, WWF helped to build a visitor center because it is closest to a major sanctuary for giant pandas. In fact, the week before I went there, a few colleagues from WWF were able to spot not one and not two and not even three, but 4 giant panda on the same day in the valley of the park. And mindful that some people who've been working on panda conservation have never seen wild panda in their life. And so this area is really precious in that sense. But the story I want to tell is on the way out from this national park, now national park, we were riding on a car and I spotted a bird with pink armpit, is the right word to say, from afar. And I asked my colleague to stop the car, and we pulled out the binoculars, and we saw a pair of crested ibis, sort of in the field, about maybe 100 meters away. And the story of the crested ibis, or Ibis nipponica, is a great story of how China were able to bring back endangered species from the edge of extinction. The story of ibis, it was believed that they were almost gone, almost extinct after the Cultural Revolution. And in early 1980s, a few pairs were found in the wild. And since then, with a lot of input from the government, but also local community scientists, environmental groups, WWF included, the population of ibis come back in a not very well, but at least not extremely endangered situation. Actually, in Kunming CBD, the CBD conference in Kunming, crested ibis was being used as one of the success story of how wildlife were able to be protected. And these guys, they live in the farm. As you can see from this photo, they're actually eating in the farm. Another story I want to share is David's deer, Milu. David's deer used to be, about 2,000 years ago, they were populated in the central Yangtze Basin. But then around Yuan Dynasty, they were almost extinct in the wild. Only a few hundreds of them exist in the royal hunting grounds. And then at the turn of the previous century, they were almost gone. And in China, and a few hundred, I think a few dozens of them were actually collected and then relocated to Western Europe. And that's how they were sort of the genealogy get preserved. And then in early 1980s, when Hong Kong was, the future of Hong Kong was being negotiated, the British government came into agreement with China that Hong Kong will have to be handed over back to China. Around that time in 1986 and 1987, 2 consecutive years, the Hong Kong banking, the HSBC, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, as an expression of friendship, returned a dozen David's deer back to China. At that point, China already have no David's deer, either in captivity or in the wild. After 30, 40 years, the number of David deers back to quite a healthy population. And there are several reserves for them now in China. Most amazingly, so after 2,000 years, they were being brought back to central Yangtze Basin. In Hubei, Ken'ezhou, there is a protected area. This is where the photo were taken. The nice story about that is when I was working with WWF, they become rewild. There was a flooding and some dozens of them escaped and sort of settled down in the farms of the peasants. And the peasants doesn't like them. They want to chase them away because they eat the crops. So what do? We designed a insurance helping the peasants. If their crops get destroyed by the deers, they can get compensated so that they don't have an incentive to chase them away. In fact, they kind of welcome them because then you have an eddy cashing out of your crops. That was quite a successful program. And right now, the deers were not only thriving in the protected area, but also in the neighboring rural area in central China, where they disappeared for more than 1,000 years. This is the landscape where they're living right now. And then the story of the giant panda, of course, the iconic wild animal that China has been successful in bringing back from the fringe of extinction. The latest census of panda population was we have 1,864 pandas in the wild, which is 16.5% increase compared to the decade before. But the story of panda is also that in a lot of the protected area, there are actually people living in or together with the pandas. In many indigenous community or ethnic minorities in the Chinese system were called, coexist with them. This is in Liangshan area in Sichuan province. WWF worked with the local government to build, as you can see from the screen, the green area is kind of the corridor linking up disjointed protected areas and providing an ecological corridor for the pandas to pass through. And the reason why the green area was not demarcated as protected area, it was not because of lesser panda activity. It was because that area is more populated with the Yi people, the Yizhu people living there. They're an ethnic minority, and this area is actually one of the poorest area in China. And part of that reason, it was not designated as part of the Giant Panda National Park. So we do a lot of public engagement activities with the kids in the community and enabling them to feel proud about their living habitat is also the habitat of the giant pandas. Second last animal I'm going to talk about is tigers. In China, we used to have several species of tigers, but then in recent times, only the northeastern tigers are still thriving. And its numbers is coming back. In the previous tiger year, which is 2010, there was a tiger summit organized by the tiger range countries with support from conservation organizations, with the leaders, including Putin and Wen Jiabao, committed to an ambitious target of doubling the number of tigers in the world. For China, the numbers, if you look at from 2013 to 14, actually is more than doubled. It's partly because of the northeastern China Dongbei area, Jilin province, for instance, neighboring Russia and North Korea. There was a lot of forest farm there before, and the Chinese government stopped the logging activities and turned those logging farms into protected area. And so we were working with local communities who were loggers before, who were forest worker. And they were now being trained, turned into rangers, and were able to do very different kind of activities in the forest. And we have one of the best stories. Some of the best anti-poaching rangers were poachers themselves when they were young, and they the best because they know how poachers think and act. This is one of the area where we pass by, and you see there's like a propaganda logos slogan there, and we have installed infrared cameras in this valley, and just a few days before we went there, there were tiger sites being spotted. Last one, Finnish poppers, Zhangtun. The Yangtze Basin is home to two freshwater dolphins. Only the Amazon Basin also have more than one kind of fresh river dolphins. But the cousin of Finnish poppers, the Baiji dolphin, is believed to be functionally extinct already in the last 2 decades. The population of Finnish poppers was really drastically dropping. When I joined WWF, it was dropping at a rate of one less in 72 hours. And you look at, they only have about 1,000 left, actually less than the number of giant pandas. It is very urgent. And with a lot of work by the local government communities and conservation organizations, we were able to stabilize the decline. And in some areas of the Yangtze Basin, numbers of river dolphins are coming back, particularly in the Oxbow Lake areas in the Central River. But this is the habitat of the Yangtze, of the Finnish poppers we're talking about. This is Dongting Lake, just outside of Yueyang. I was on a trip to look at the protected area, and the protected area is just right next to this busy channel of sand badgers and factories along the coast. There's 5 animals that I share with you were, in one way or another, they're in different places of the declining or recovering curve of biodiversity in China. But all of them show that they are actually very close to where people live in China. There are a lot of coexistence of human activities and the habitats of these wild animals. So don't get me wrong, I don't want to paint a picture that China was successful because we were able to kind of like stop people's activities and leave them alone. But it was a very different way of thinking about how we can coexist with the wildlife. But we are only winning selective battles, but we are losing the war. This graph shows the ecological decline of China in different aspects. The lower one, you can see the Living Planet Index, and index WWF designed it to showcase how biodiversity, vitality of biodiversity is going down. This is using the indication of terrestrial vertebrates to show in China. And you can see in about 40, 50 years, it declined about half. And we are confronted with an unprecedented global ecological crisis. We consume 1.75 planets globally. Obviously, we only have one planet. We don't have more than one. We don't have 1.1, we don't have 1.75. It is entirely unsustainable. China, if we divide that into a country parameter, China is about using 2.2. It's higher than global average already, but it's not as high as the US. So in a way, we are facing this unprecedented ecological crisis of human society ever seen. And I describe it as when when people are conquering our nature world for our own benefits, we also leaving traces of our activities and changing the nature of nature forever, right? And so welcome to the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is said to be a geological era where we have altered our planet to such an extent that, many thousand or even tens of thousands of years into the future, when people or living beings from the future looking back, they will see the impact of human Homo sapiens, human beings left on the planet in these few generations. But then comes the challenge. What is nature in our times of Anthropocene? Is there still a nature beyond human intervention? And when we say, we environmentalists say that we are protecting nature, what does we really mean? Is there a sort of pre-intervention, a primordial, unpolluted, sort of virgin nature we can go back to? If not, then what are we conserving when we say we are conservationists? What are we really protecting? And how can we be an environmentalist after nature? We are facing this crisis, and it's a triple crisis. It's climate, biodiversity loss, but also equity. And let me quote Johan Roström. I really like his work. He was challenging us, the paradigm, the way we see the problem. He's trying to challenge us that we need to think about abundance within planetary boundaries. Well, he was famous of developing this idea of planetary boundaries. It requires us to have a mind shift that it is not good enough to think about growth without limits, but that's the old model, modernization, if you like, and not limits to growth. Well, the famous limits to growth thesis, the Club of Rome, a lot of the 1970s, 80s environmentalist thinking were sort of centered around that. Even today, a lot of discussion about zero growth. But how do we think about growth within limits? It's difficult. We have tried to plot a different level of development of countries by using the Human Development Index, which is measuring not GDP, but things like infant mortality rates, literacy rates, etc. Per doctor per 1,000 person. So it's really trying to measure level of social development. And then on the vertical side, we match it against ecological footprint. And then you can see from this graph, the big red dot there is the US, right? Very high level of ecological footprint, and also very high level of human development. And then you have the several purplish countries in Europe, and then the pink ones. And then the two big orange circle, yellowish circle, China and India, respectively. And then you have Africa's, right? So it's quite easy to understand. This is about mid 2010s, 2014 or 2015, this graph. And the lower hand green box is what I call the magical box. Is where human society ideally should be going into, right? Where we'll be enjoying high level of social development, but also within the fair share of the capacity of per person of that country. Obviously, none of the country were in that spot. A few smaller countries are close to them, but the major economies are far from it. So the traditional growth model, the growth without limit model, modernization, if you like, is Model A, right? We believe that developing countries should all develop like the West have done. Model B is very much the environmental movement in the West since 1960s are trying to do, right? Not reducing the level of human development, economic well-being of people, but trying to reduce or decouple our ecological footprint, our impact on the environment. Now, the challenge, however, for this big group of the orange and the pinks, the developing countries, the emerging economies, is to keep developing, improving livelihood while ducking below the ecological limits. And that is a different trajectory that they need to go through. I try to show a few examples of emerging economies and their trajectory. At least in this graph, it's not showing that, it's showing that they are closer to the Model C pathway rather than the Model A, hopefully, more so in reality. This is where we want those countries to go and not develop like the industrialized developed economies. I mean, already right now we consume more than one planet. If China or Brazil or India will be having the same per capita ecological footprint of, let's say, the United States, we would need at least 5-6 planets for that, right? So Kay Walsworth adjusted the planetary boundary model of Johan Rockström. So Johan Rockström suggested that we can quantify now with the advance of science where the planetary boundary are, and therefore we can consciously stay within those boundaries and not overshooting ourselves. Case suggested that, well, but we also need to, not only to think about ecological ceiling, but also social foundation, where, in order to meet with the basic needs of people, all the people in the planet, we need to use resources, some of them. So that sort of donut-like green circle is where the safe and just space for humanity to coexist with the planet. And if we plot what we see, the model A, B, C, you can see how the differences are. And I think that model is very interesting because it kind of connotates a different way of thinking about our relationship with the environment, and that it has to be just enough, right? It's just enough for individual consumption, but also justice enough, having equity enough for everyone, so that the needs of the poor would be also taken care of. And so I think what President Xi Jinping talked about as the ecological civilization, as a way of going beyond the industrial civilization. I mean, you can put model A and B as the conventional trajectory and the reaction to that within the industrial civilization age. Ecological civilization could be understood as the necessary trajectory of moving the rest of the planet from where they are to the magic box, the lower green box on the right-hand side. Well, obviously the Chinese government is not exactly saying that. I'm just saying that the ecological civilization narrative provide a discursive resources for us to be engaged in to reimagine what development could look like for the future. And so we need a new deal for people and nature. And that was the slogan for a lot of the conservation groups drumming up to Kunming. And basically the challenge requires to bend these two curves to reduce the global emission of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, but also to bend the downward trend of biodiversity loss upwards again. But in order to do that, we need to make it explicit that the reason why we preserving the environment is also for the benefit, for the continuity of human civilization on this planet, for the 9-10 billions of people, for their basic needs. Edward Wilson published a book called Half Planet, and it captured a lot of the Western environmentalist imagination about we need to keep half of the planet unpolluted, undeveloped, so as to keep the biodiversity. We have a huge debate before Kunming, and I was one of the advocates of, we have to be very careful about this binary imagination of the future. We wouldn't, and Edward Wilson didn't say that, but it's very easy to be misinterpreted as half planet, meaning that, well, if you look at the map, where half of the planet can be preserved and so in a relatively uninterrupted states, a lot of them are in the developing countries. So a half planet thesis will easily slip into kicking the development ladder, where the West, the developed world, keep what they have and then prevent developing countries to use their resources to improve their livelihoods. So that is not a just and fair vision for the world. So then what? It was in that internal debate, thinking about what kind of quantifiable objective we should propose for nature conservation on a planetary scale, that we have a lot of reflection on what we can learn from the experience of modern times conservation in China. So I'm going to end this in the next few slides. This is very immature, but I just want to share some initial thoughts with you. I think in the intellectual tradition of Chinese history, there has always been an interesting relationship with nature, with sanshui, with mountain and rivers, from the intelligentsia, from the poets back then, poets also officials. As you can see, well, this is Qianli Jiangshan Tu, Song Dynasty famous water ink painting. It's typical of any Chinese water ink painting that you always have traces of human settlement, human activities in the mountains and in the rivers. It is not a binary juxtaposition. This is a painting from the Tang Dynasty. It depicts the emperor during An Si Zi Luan, Tang Minghuang. He was fleeing from Xi'an, right, the capital of Tang Dynasty back then, to Sichuan. So the title of the painting was called Ming Wang, the Emperor of Ming Dynasty, Xin Su, blessing Sichuan. Well, of course, he was actually fleeing from an internal revolt. So if you think about his fleeing from Xi'an to Sichuan, which area he is going to go pass by? In fact, the mountains here depicted were very much the Qingling area connected to the Sichuan mountains, Minshan, Shanxi, the Minshan ranges, where both these mountain areas are where the giant pandas live. And remember the crested ibis that I showed? She is probably, or her ancestor is probably somewhere in the field here. And snow leopards as well in this area. And as early as in Tang Dynasty, those areas are also quite frequently visited by travelers, as you can see in the painting. There are bridges there. And they're not considered as wilderness in the modern Western sense. And the Taoyuan means peach blossom paradise. I was just finished reading Red Moon, a sci-fi novel by Kim Stan Robinson. it was interesting how he turned the peach blossom paradise into allegory of a near future time when China is having a moon base. Anyway, the peach blossom paradise is kind of like a Chinese intellectual tradition of heaven on earth, of utopia world where people live harmoniously with each other. There is this social cohesion, selfishness, yeah. But also peace with nature, right? And in fact, the poem inspired generations and generations of poem, actually paintings in China. And this is a poem by also using the cherry blossom mythology. But I want to call into attention to the last phrase. 别有天地非人间, to other lands beyond this mortal dream. This other land, 非人间. So it is on the earth, but it's not quite part of the earth. It is part of, but beyond what we normally know. So 洞天, what the poem referred to, was a Taoist concept. It was believed that in those 洞天s across China, those areas where the Taoist practitioners can connect themselves with the heavenly energy and become immortal and connect themselves there. But if you have been to one of these 洞天s, they're demarcated on the map, and we can know where they are right now. I actually visited. This is a photo that I took in Qingchengshan in Dujiangyan city of Sichuan. After 2 hours of hike into the mountain, you really see kind of like this area where it's enclosed by mountains, and then it has a very special feeling to it. It's very special. But the point here is, about 2,000 years ago, in the Taoist tradition, but it was actually the 春秋战国时代, the Warring State era. It is actually understandable. They have social functions. These what I quote from Professor Skipper, Shi Zhouren, and Yuan Bingning. They have been studying the Taoist tradition of protected areas. I mean, arguably, they are the first human protected areas, sanctuaries of its kind. About 2,000 years old, there were clear, from the research from Professor Skipper and Yuan Bingning, there were clear written sort of customs of what to do and not do in the sanctuaries, in the 洞天s, such as not poisoning the water and don't kill wild animals there, etc. But it has a social function because in the age of warring states, nearby cities and villages, they would like to have a place where they can retreat to, right? Where they can hide away from warfare or other disasters, and still be able to keep them alive and sort of hide there for a few years or for a few months, and then they can go back to their home village. So they are very close to human settlement, but they are in a way protected areas, but also there are human activities and they are protected for human use as well. I tried to overlay the 洞天s, which is sorry about the scale. The 洞天s, which are the blue droplets, and then the modern times protected area. You can see a huge overlap. In fact, a lot of the post-liberation protected area systems the location are interestingly overlapping with the historical Dongtians. And I want to end with the Taoist saying of 道法自然. So Tao, the way, models itself from nature. But here is tricky because 自然 could be translated as nature. It has been translated as nature. It is the Chinese phrase to use to translate the capital letter N, nature, after modern science. But back then, 2000 years ago, when Lao Tzu was writing it more or less mean the ways as it is. Now, nature in our time, the way it is no longer a nature we can turn back to, primordial nature we can turn back to. It is an Anthropocene nature, right? It is a nature that is always already intervened, polluted, transformed, engineered by human activities. So how can we envision a world in a more crowded, a much hotter, much more resources deprived planet? How can we thrive and coexist with nature? I want to think about not in binary terms, like half Earth or half polluted, half preserved. Maybe in a yin-yang concept of there is always you and in me and me and you. There is always nature in human society and human activities in nature. That it is fluid, that it is a organic whole. It is in contradiction with each other, but then how do you maintain that harmonious contradiction? How do you keep that balance of energy? Here, I don't, as an environmentalist trained up in Western education and have worked in Western organizations for 2 decades, I want to reflect on the very knowledge system we use we apply to our work, to understand, but also to envision the future for human and our environment. How we can go beyond this this knowledge that is part of maybe it's part of the problem, right? This binary opposition of man versus nature, possibly one could argue is the philosophical origin of the massive environmental challenges that we are seeing on a planetary scale. What resources we can tap into from our own long history of intellectual inquiry into the relationship of human and nature to inform us, to imagine the future for us in a nature that is already Anthropocene stage. I'll stop here and see if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sze Ping, for that really wonderfully wide-ranging and inspiring talk. I love how you were able to interweave both empirical and philosophical elements into your analysis. If you have any questions as members of the audience, please take the time to put them into the Q&A chat button right now, and I'll read them on your behalf. Maybe to get started, I have a couple of questions of my own that I was thinking about as you were going to talk. So Ping, at one point you were talking about, this need to achieve high social development coupled with keeping our ecological footprint quite low. And you were sort of talking about this on a fairly abstract level, but I was wondering if you could speak about this in more practical terms, drawing on your own experience, having worked for all of these environmental NGOs in China. What kinds of practical advice do you give to people, or do you give to corporations or governments in order to try to achieve these models that you so nicely laid out for us?
Well, I mean, obviously, as the graph showed, none of the existing human society are already in that ideal, that cherry blossom box. But I think there are new possibilities open up now, right? With the whole mechanization of production, with new internet database, with, for example, the Chinese government promoting circular economy. You know, it is entirely possible to recycle all the water we use in the production cycle and have a net zero water footprint of industrial production of certain products. Like technologically, it is entirely possible, right? So I think the idea is really about, you know, what kind of future do we envision? Do we envision a future we can have unlimited growth, like just keep 10%, 15% GDP growth, and then just externalizing all our problem and costs to the environment? Or once, when we have to internalize the environmental costs and limit the boundary, then we need to, then, you know, the phrase of Johann Rockström talking about growth within limits becomes possible. You know, it requires not only technological innovation, but it also requires a different mode of thinking about how we use resources. I was just reading a report earlier this morning. In the United States, we produce 130 kilograms of plastic, throwaway plastic, every year per capita. We are the largest. I mean, the United States is the largest country of per capita waste, plastic waste generation. This obviously is unsustainable, right? I mean, many studies show that, one study showed that by 2050, we will have more plastic in the ocean than the biomass of marine life. It is just insane. And all these plastics are actually useful materials. You know, if we would have I mean, the problem is not plastic itself. The problem is the linear production and disposal of plastics. If we can have a closed loop of plastic as a raw material, and that we recycle all the plastic that we have already generated in this planet, we probably have enough plastic for everyone to use for many, many generations. So what I'm trying to say is it will require new technology, but also, more importantly, new ways of thinking about how we apply technology.
Right. So the materials themselves aren't necessarily the problem. It's how we're thinking about them, how we're using them. So this is a question from the anthropologist Mayfair Young, who is interested in how you ended the talk talking about Taoism, which I thought was super fascinating. And she asks, while working in China, have you discovered that Taoist people and institutions have led environmental efforts?
I know Professor Sze Ping personally, and well, he passed away already, but he and his students have been working in Wuyishan with a group of Taoist practitioners. So I think that they've been doing really good work over there. But maybe I didn't make myself clear. My point was, let's turn back to Taoism and let's be Taoist. That was not my point. My point was what we can learn from intellectual tradition, both the imagination but the resources that they use, and in a way the polemics that they themselves are sort of getting themselves into. I mean, the whole idea of a cherry blossom society is as much as a contemporary critique of the political situation back then, right? So I was trying to reconnect to our intellectual tradition to see what kind of resources we can learn and use and appropriate to help us to think about the future that we need. And I'm not even suggesting that we need to be religious. I mean, I was not going that way. I was trying to say, from this rich tradition of knowledge, there are some insights we can get that maybe we can help ourselves to get out from this limitation of binary thinking of modern times.
So my colleague in the history department, David Fedman, is asking a question about the ground level politics of nature conservation in China today. And he's curious about what the limits and possibilities of environmental activism look like. Are there opportunities for grassroots efforts to achieve environmental protection, transparency, and accountability? So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I'm from Hong Kong, so when I first worked in mainland China, that was 1999. I acquainted with Liang Chongjie, who was the founder of Zhanjiu, Friends of Nature, and they are one of the first environmental NGO in China. I was very fascinated by at that time they were trying to raise awareness of the public to protect Zhangyang, Tibetan antelopes in the Qinghai plateau area. At that time, there was a lot of illegal poaching for Tibetan antelopes for the how to say in English, for the skin to make for the hair of the skin to make pashmina, and but after 20 years, it was very successful. Tibetan antelopes are very well protected now. And in fact, I think from an ecological point of view, probably some carefully calculated culling would be needed in order to keep them in a healthy relationship with the local ecology. But the reason I want to brought up with Friends of Nature is that 2 weeks ago, I think, Friends of Nature, they have one of their recent campaign get highly recognized by the government. It is about the green peacock. So someone proposed to build a large hydro station in Yunnan province over the habitats of the green peacocks, and the EIA was not done properly, and they didn't talk about the green peacocks. The environmentalists find it out, the documentation, and then make a big public campaign out of it. And then Friends of Nature brought it to the court and win a public interest litigation and stopped it, the large hydro dam. Disclaimer, I sit on the board of Friends of Nature. This is one of the campaigns that I was involved. I think that is a very good example of a unique space for grassroots NGOs to work within the system, but also, let's say, on the fringe of the system, and work with aligned forces within the government. I mean, in that case, the central government environmental ministry, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, against local, specific local entrenched interests who could benefit from the building of the large hydro stations, despite all the possible laws and regulations it has violated. So I think that case is a very good example of, almost like a 伊丽莎坑事件, almost like a case where you can discover a lot of the intricate details of contemporary environmental politics in China.
Have you yourself ever encountered any real resistance from corporations or the Chinese Communist Party for your grassroots efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like in many other countries, environmentalists, environmental rights defenders always encounter challenges from the established interests, be they legitimate or illegitimate. The situation in China is similar, no different. But I think with the current terms of government, the holding the banner of ecological civilization, that provide a lot of legitimacy and discursive resources for grassroots environmentalists to advance the agenda of protecting the environment versus localized interests.
Right. So your goals I think, are quite aligned right now with this vision of ecological civilization that Xi Jinping is promoting. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. This question comes from David Peets, and I'll just read it because it's a little long, but he says that, you suggested that the conceptual approach that seems to guide the Western environmental organizations needs to be revised. And he wants you to expand on this perspective. Is it simply a conceptual approach of half the world for human development and half the world that we should leave ecologically untouched? It seems that this is perhaps an antiquated idea among environmentalists, or are there other approaches that have been placed?
Yeah, so I want to qualify that I didn't try to implicate Edward Wilson's book as that. I've been quite careful that the title of the book could easily lead to or getting misunderstood as, we can advocate for a future where half the world is protected, half the world, whatever. That is not what Edward Wilson say, and I didn't do justice to that probably. But I think there is a long sort of underlying tradition of thinking nature versus man, and I mean capital letter man, capital nature, and well, nature culture as well, and the whole concept of wilderness, like an untouched place without human activities. It was an imagination, right? Even the wilderness in North America, there were American Indians living there when the first generation explorers, settlers went there and be amazed with the wilderness. And I think the point was, since human activities on this planet, they're really not such a concept of a place called nature that is untouched by human activities. It is very much a romanticization of a bypass in the early industrial time. Think about German Romanticism. And so I'm not saying that environmentalists are exactly advocating that, but that is an undertone of that when we talk about protecting the environment. I mean, even the saying, the English phrase of let's protect the environment. I mean, you can only protect something when you're not part of it, right? You can't take man away from the immediate ecology. Then you can talk about protecting it from its exteriority. So I think there is a conceptual history there that we need to unpack and be explicit about that. We have to go beyond those thinking. And I don't mean to pull up a straw man of saying, oh yeah, Western organizations are promoting this. I think that's not fair. And even in the organization that I work with, WWF, there's a lot of, since early times, actually since 1980s, there's a lot of sort of community-led conservation programs all around the world, in Africa as well, in Latin America, in Asia, of course. So I think what I'm trying to say, I didn't want to put up a new binary of kind of the Orient versus the West. I think very much in the spirit of Chen Guangxin's Asia as method discussion. So how can we go beyond using the West as the universal theory, the only reference framework for the work that we talk about? How do we talk about and learn from non-Western experiences to each other, and using the West as one of the many reference points?
Great. Well, we are just about at the end of the hour. I think, Sze Ping, you've brought up so many fascinating points that I'd love to talk with you about more, but we're out of time. So I will end the event here. Once again, I would like to thank Sze Ping Lo for taking time out of his very busy schedule to give that super interesting talk. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. We will be back next year with more talks and China-focused content. So until then, please take care, and my very best wishes for a happy holiday season.
Thank you.